Okay, this is going to be a WWE pay-per-view rewind of the year 1990. So I decided I want to go back to the 90s and, do some rewinds from the 1990s. Just a lot of great memories and, matches and shows that I haven't seen yet. So decided to go back to the year 1990, 25 years ago. Now, at this time, the late 80s and the early 90s, some people consider this the golden era of professional wrestling in terms of, star power, the amount of money that was made. It was a very profitable time for the business. You had a lot of larger than life, guys in their prime, like Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, Macho Man, Randy Savage, just so many larger than life names. So, if you were a kid at the time, it was definitely a magical time in professional wrestling. This, I would say like 1990, 91, if you were a kid, you would always talk about wrestling, no matter where you went. The business was definitely hot at that time. So, but I will say this, watching these shows back, it really makes you appreciate the product now, especially as an adult. I feel like if you think the product is geared for kids now, then, look at it back then. It was really geared for kids. Everything was just about merchandising, action figures, getting families to show up to the events. It was, it just makes you appreciate how much more effort they put into making the WWE more of a variety show now, to incorporate a lot of the, great workers and, it's more of a mixed bag now. So a lot of people do shit on the product now as expected, but back then it was really over the top with, just attracting kids and families. So I just wanted to make that point first. But when we look at the year 1990, it was, really not a lot of footage to talk about. This is going to be tough to do compared to, a year like 2007 or any of the 2000s, because there's not a lot of shows to go through. So I can't give you top 10 matches, top 10 MVP candidates. It's really tough to gauge that. Not really a lot of television footage to really go through either. So we have just 4 pay-per-views: WrestleMania, or Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam, Survivor Series. King of the Ring didn't come about until 1993. So the Royal Rumble 1990, at this time, Hulk Hogan was the champion. You didn't have the championship match at the Royal Rumble, so Hogan was actually the champion and participated in the Royal Rumble. So what did the Royal Rumble really mean back then? Not really much. The winner of that match didn't get a main event shot at WrestleMania. That didn't happen, I believe, until 93 officially. So we had an awful undercard, probably one of the worst undercards in Royal Rumble history. Really, the only thing worth talking about was the Greg the Hammer Valentine and Ronnie Garvin match. Just a pleasant surprise there. They kind of brought that NWA style to the WWE at the time for that match. Just a wicked, rugged match right there. That is probably one of the most underrated matches of all time. I never heard anyone talk about it. I totally forgot about it. So there we go. Check that match out on the WWE Network if you haven't had a chance. But as far as the actual Royal Rumble match, it was somewhat dull. Ted DiBiase actually entered as number 1. He pretty much set the record at the time for lasting in the Royal Rumble. Macho Man, Jake the Snake, Dusty Rhodes, a lot of those guys entered in the beginning. So you had a lot of the great star power eliminated early. It wasn't until the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan came out that you had really something to talk about. This was the first time that they had, I think, met in a wrestling ring. So you had the stare down, the double clothesline. Some people consider it one of the greatest Royal Rumble moments ever. So Warrior eventually got eliminated by Hogan in the match, and it came down to Hogan going up against Rick Rude and Mr. Perfect. Hogan eliminates Perfect. He tosses him over the top turnbuckle to get his first Royal Rumble victory. So what did it really mean? Hogan's the champion, wins the Royal Rumble. I think it was a good decision at the time. If you look at the previous Royal Rumble winners, you had Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and then you had Big John Studd. So in order to enhance the credibility of the Rumble, why not just have the biggest star in the business win the Rumble? But some people might argue if you really wanted to push Ultimate Warrior as the next generation superstar, as the leader of the new generation, why not have him win the Rumble and WrestleMania? But, why would you order WrestleMania 6 if you saw Hogan, or Warrior win the Rumble and then he'd be going up against the champion Hogan? So I think they made the right call having Hogan win that Rumble. So, it is what it is. So we move on to WrestleMania 6 in Toronto in the Sky Dome. And, this WrestleMania, it's all about the main event. Everything else on the show just felt like filler. I'll go through some of the highlights from the undercard. You had way too many. See, the thing is, back then, I feel like you had way too many matches on the WrestleManias. And today it's like the opposite. They jam everyone into like a Money in the Bank or a Battle Royal. And I just feel like you don't get enough at WrestleMania nowadays, because you have the Hall of Fame and you have the national anthem and all that stuff takes up so much time. So back then, I think it was the opposite. I think you had too much wrestling, just too many guys on the card. It just would have been so much better if they cut a lot of the fat out of the card and reduced the show to like maybe 7 or 8 matches. It would have been such a better card, because you definitely had the talent back then to pull off a monumental show, especially when you factor in all the tag teams and all the guys that came up through the territories. They definitely did have a lot of talent. But some of the best moments on the undercard, you had Andre the Giant turn babyface after Bobby the Brain Heenan, kind of scolded him. Some people consider that a great WrestleMania moment. Roddy Piper versus Bad News Brown, probably one of the most controversial WrestleMania moments. Piper actually painted himself half black. So, at the time he got away with it, but I think if that happened today, there's no way Piper would have survived that. That would have been, kind of a career suicide move. I think it did cause some controversy. I just can't remember how much it really did cause. You had Macho Man Randy Savage and Sensational Queen Sherri teaming up to face Dusty Rhodes and the Sweet Sapphire. And this was kind of corny. I think Dusty Rhodes running the WWF was less than memorable. The whole thing with Sapphire. I don't know. I thought it was kind of corny. It was kind of a waste of Savage at WrestleMania 6. Even some of the matches that people consider good on the show, I just didn't care for. Like, Brutus the Barber, Beefcake, and Mr. Perfect. I thought that was kind of boring, even though from an athletic standpoint, it's one of the most... is potentially one of the better matches on the show. And also you had Jake the Snake Roberts and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. The fans actually started doing the wave during the match. So you just didn't have a lot of great stuff. Even the Rockers in the Orient Express was very, very dull in comparison to what they would do, a year later down the road. The Hart Foundation faced the Bolsheviks in a pretty awesome squash match. But other than that, man, I just thought this was a very, very dull card. It would have been one of the worst WrestleManias of all time if not for the star-studded main event. So you had title versus title, the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, taking on the WWF Champion, Hulk Hogan. And, I would say this about the match. I think it's a great main event. For that time, it was a great main event. I think it exceeded expectations. I think visually... It's one of the most fascinating things you'll ever see in the wrestling ring. I mean, it legitimately looks like two superheroes, two, gods just going at it. That's what it looks like. So it was a very attractive matchup to watch visually. These are not the two of the best wrestlers in the world, obviously, but I felt like Hogan was good in this match. Hogan was really able to be somewhat of a ring general. So I like that about the match. Warrior did some impressive things too with the gorilla press on Hogan. I thought the finish came off amazing. I really think this is one of the best finishes to a championship match you'll ever see. It was shocking. I mean, it's a very important matchup. People still talk about it to this day. I mean, Warrior's the first guy to pin Hogan clean. So at the time, I think they did make the right call in retrospect. The Ultimate Warrior was hot. I like the fact that Hogan took the loss hard. If you watch the Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior DVD, I mean, Hogan was like, I don't want to be the one to tell you so, but I told you so. They tried to paint this picture like the Ultimate Warrior was, a flash in the pan, that no one really gave a shit when he won the title. Everyone was looking at Hogan when he was riding on the ramp, backstage after he lost the match. I think that's bullshit, though. I thought the victory came off great. I thought I think people were really excited to see the change of the guard. But the fact that Hogan really took the loss hard, it kind of made me gain a little bit of, more respect for him. I think it's good when you have guys that, want to be champion, want to be on top. Because I feel like, you know, when you got guys like, when you have guys that have the attitude of, you know, I don't need the championship to be successful, or I don't need the championship to, you know, to enjoy myself in the WWE. I feel like if you have too many guys with that mentality, I don't think it's good for the roster. I mean, there was a time when both Jericho and Michaels had that mentality in the early 2000s, and I just don't think it was good for business. I just think it's better. Even back then, you know, it's you know, Hogan showed a lot of Bret Hart. You know, Bret always had this mentality, like he always wanted to be the man, always wanted to be the champion. And I feel like back then you had that. You know, Warrior never wanted to lose the belt. You know, Macho Man Randy Savage took a lot of pride in being champion, and Hogan as well. You had three icons that, you know, were legitimately fighting over the belt. So I think that's what made it, you know, somewhat of a special time back then. But I'll say this about the Ultimate Warrior. You know, he just won the title. You know, he took a lot of shit on the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior DVD. You know, there was people saying that he wasn't, you know, cut out to be, you know, the man, you know, but, you know, and you have Hogan and all these guys saying that, you know, back then there was just one guy. It wasn't like it is today with, you know, 5 or 6 guys, you know, drawing money at house shows. It was just one guy. I don't think anything could be further from the truth, because, you know, I lived during that time, and in 1990, 1991, you know, Warrior was definitely, I would even put him ahead of Hogan in terms of popularity. You know, everyone wanted to be the Ultimate Warrior for Halloween, and, you know, I always felt like, you know, the older brothers were the Warrior, and the little brothers had to settle for being Hulk Hogan. That's how it was at the time. So to say that Hogan was by far the only guy drawing the shows, I think it's, I don't think that's factually correct to say that. So the Ultimate Warrior was huge. I mean, it was a short span, you know, 1990, 91. I felt like it lost a lot of momentum after the SummerSlam fiasco. But at that time, man, Warrior, to me, you know, as a kid, I just remember he was bigger than anybody. So so from there we go on to SummerSlam 1990, and this was this is somewhat of a forgettable SummerSlam. It looks a lot better on paper than it actually was. I mean, man, they wasted a lot of time just doing nothing on the show. I mean, there's just a lot of time just with just random interviews, backstage stuff that just was, a lot of it was just unnecessary. So they killed about maybe an hour if you add up all the backstage stuff. Some of the highlights from the show: Mr. Perfect and Texas Tornado had an excellent Intercontinental Championship match. It was just a little bit too short. Hart Foundation faced Demolition, 2 out of 3 falls. Definitely the second best match of the year, arguably definitely the best tag match of that year. The Legion of Doom actually came out to help assist the Hart Foundation with the victory. But man, even if from a technical standpoint and from a wrestling standpoint, even back in 1990, it's obvious Bret Hart was still the best wrestler in the WWE at that time. So, yeah, definitely. There was a feud between Earthquake and Hulk Hogan. They had their big match at SummerSlam, which is pretty underrated. I would say probably one of the better matches of that year on pay-per-view was Hulk Hogan and Earthquake. Also, from a storyline standpoint at SummerSlam, you actually had Sapphire actually sell out to the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. So that ignited a whole feud between Dusty Rhodes and DiBiase. They really made Dusty Rhodes look like a fool here. I mean, he really did. You really felt sorry for him. But, you know, Sapphire selling out to the $1 Million Man, you know, it was pretty, it kind of made you hate Sapphire at that time. So, and then the main event, you had the Ultimate Warrior versus Rick Rude in a steel cage. You know, Rick Rude is one of the guys that really went out of his way, busted his ass to make the Warrior look good. He was a great opponent for Warrior because he was in great shape. He was athletic. He could bump like a bitch. And, yeah, they had a good cage match. It kind of ended abruptly, but, you know, while it lasted, I thought this was, excellent stuff. Just a great way to hide Warrior's weaknesses. And, I thought both guys looked strong here. This was probably Rick Rude's last WWF match before I think he went to WCW. So he put over Warrior pretty gracefully on the way out. So that was SummerSlam in Philadelphia in 1990. Not a great SummerSlam, but some good moments on the show. Definitely a good card. I just think it could have been booked a little bit better if they cut out some of those, all those. There was just an enormous amount of interviews on that show. It's crazy to think about how much there were. They really went over the top with it. So we end the pay-per-view series with the Survivor Series 1990. This is the pay-per-view of the year. I still wouldn't call it great, but I've talked about this before, how the Survivor Series back then were just a lot better. I mean, they just had better teams. You had guys that were invested in feuds, like the Warriors team faced Perfect's team, Hulk Hogan's team faced the Earthquakes team, Jake the Snake Roberts faced, Rick the Mata Martel's team, the Dream Team versus the $1 Million team. It just seemed like everything just fit perfectly back then, as far as the Survivor Series teams. It just seems like maybe after 2003, it seems like Austin versus Bischoff from Survivor Series 2003 was really the last time I think the Survivor Series traditional series worked. It seems like every time after that, they always felt like random, very put together. It was just tough to get excited for those some of the recent Survivor Series matches. But back then, this is an interesting concept here in 1990, because if you were the sole survivor of your team, you advanced to the main event, and they called it the grand finale. They actually had the baby faces versus the heels. It was kind of corny, but that's the way they did it. So you had Hogan, Warrior, and Tito Santana as the sole survivors of their teams. So they teamed up in the main event, and they took on, the $1 Million Man, Rick the Mata Martel, Power and Glory. And I believe it was the Warlord in the main event. So there we go with that. The most interesting thing about the Survivor Series 1990 was the Undertaker. Ted DiBiase actually had a mystery opponent, and it was just a great moment. And I have to say, DiBiase was great here. I mean, they couldn't have picked a better guy to introduce the Undertaker. The moment just came off great. When Taker came out, he definitely had a presence. I don't think anyone knew who the hell he was, but he was an instant star. He had an instant presence, instant credibility. I thought he looked really, and you forget how young he was at the time. I think he was only like maybe 25, maybe 26 at that time. So Taker started off really young. We always think of him as this old dog, but he got a pretty early start. And I would say that was probably one of the better matches of the year, actually. Taker actually got counted out, so he did not get pinned in that match. But that matchup, it came down to, Bret Hart was actually on Dusty Rhodes' team, so Dusty got eliminated. But it came down to Ted DiBiase and Bret Hart. And great stuff between those two guys. That was probably one of the better traditional Survivor Series matches of all time, right there. So I just thought Survivor Series 1990 was a really fun show. Definitely the pay-per-view of the year all around. Definitely a fun moment at the end of the show with Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior being the sole survivors. So that's pretty much it, guys. That was the WWF Pay-Per-View Rewind in 1990. I would say the match of the year was definitely Warrior versus Hogan at WrestleMania 6. The runner-up would be Hart Foundation versus Demolition at SummerSlam. And then in third place, I'd probably put the Dream Team versus the $1 Million Team from Survivor Series, featuring an awesome ending between Bret Hart and Bret Hart and Ted DiBiase, with DiBiase going over at the end of that match. Probably one of the first signals that Bret Hart was going to have an amazing singles career was his performance against DiBiase at the end of that match. I thought it was funny how when Bret got pinned, he looks at the camera and just goes like, "Fuck." So he's just such a competitor. You could just see Bret Hart's probably one of the most competitive, probably the most competitive, wrestler in WWE history. So that's pretty much it. As far as MVPs, it's so tough to say who was the MVP. I definitely think Hogan was a little bit stale in 1990. So I think they made the right call giving Warrior the title. I mean, I would give Warrior the MVP in terms of drawing, in terms of character development. That's who I think a lot of the people paid to see. So I'll probably give the MVP to the Ultimate Warrior, definitely the top babyface in the company. But as far as tag teams go, you had the Rockers were there, Shawn Michaels was starting to break out, the Hart Foundation, Demolition, Legion of Doom. You had a lot of great tag teams. As far as heels go, as far as mic work, I'd probably give the MVP to Ted DiBiase. I really would. I think $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase was probably, it's a shame because I think at that time, storyline wise, it would have been perfect. Mr. Perfect. Yeah, but it would have been awesome if DiBiase had a reign as a heel. I really think he could have gotten a lot out of that. But I think back then they were so consumed of, drawing money, drawing houses. And I think Vince McMahon's mindset was the babyface has to draw the show. So you have to put the title on the babyface. Mr. Perfect was a great Intercontinental champion. He had a lot of good matches with the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. I thought Tito Santana was actually a great babyface as well. Man, he was definitely one of the better workers from Mexico. Made his way to the WWF. He had an amazing career. He was still at the top of his game at that time. But I just wanted to focus on heels. The top three heels at that time, I think, were DiBiase, Perfect, Mr. Perfect, great Intercontinental champion, like I said, and Macho Man Randy Savage. Savage really this year, it was kind of a waste for him. It just seemed like year by year, Savage was wrestling less and less. I didn't like him with Sensational Queen Sherri. They actually called him Macho King, Randy Savage, at that time. He was in that filler feud with Dusty Rhodes, which I really didn't care for. But Savage was still a hell of a talent, and they pretty much were setting him up for the Ultimate Warrior as the year progressed. So really not a lot to talk about for Macho Man Randy Savage. It was probably one of the more down years of his career after having such a hot run in 88 and 89. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's 1990. Let me know what you thought of the year, and hope you enjoyed the video.